He saved a starving native boy, but the next morning, 200 warriors surrounded his barn. Jack Carter had spent most of his life on the vast plains, away from the bustling cities and crowded towns. His ranch, isolated in the heart of the wilderness, was the only place that ever felt like home. The land was harsh and unforgiving, but it was his, and he had learned to thrive in its solitude. For years, the only company he had were his loyal horse, Thunder, and the occasional travelers who passed through. Jack had learned not to trust many people, but there was something about the land. It had a way of keeping people at a distance, leaving him alone with his thoughts. One night, as Jack was finishing his evening chores, the sky suddenly darkened. A storm, unlike any he had seen before, moved in quickly, swirling the desert dust into the air. The wind howled, and the first drops of rain splashed onto the dry earth. Jack quickly made his way back to the barn, his thoughts on the storm and the safety of his animals. As he approached the barn, the harsh wind tugged at his coat, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm was not waiting for anyone, but something unusual caught his eye. A figure stumbling through the rain, a boy no older than 12, was moving slowly toward him. Jack squinted against the rain, unsure if what he was seeing was real. The boy's clothes were torn, his face pale, and his body seemed weak, as though he had been walking for days. Jack's heart tugged at the sight. He wasn't sure who this boy was or where he had come from, but something about the situation felt wrong. The boy was alone in the storm, and that wasn't something Jack could ignore. Without hesitation, Jack rushed to the boy's side. He threw an arm around him, supporting him as he stumbled through the mud. The boy didn't say a word, his breathing shallow, his eyes wide with fear. Jack carefully led him into the barn, where it was dry and warmer. The barn smelled of hay and leather, the familiar scent of his animals. Jack guided the boy to a pile of hay and made him sit down. He quickly grabbed a blanket, draping it over the boy's shivering shoulders. "Easy now," Jack said softly, trying to comfort him. The boy didn't respond, but Jack could see his chest rising and falling slowly, a sign that he wasn't entirely lost to the storm. He went to the nearby table, grabbed some water, and brought it back to the boy. The boy hesitated for a moment before drinking, his eyes still wide, unsure of his surroundings. Jack sat down on a wooden crate, studying the boy. His face was streaked with dirt, his hair matted from the rain. He looked to be around 12, but there was a look in his eyes that made him seem older, as if he had seen things a boy should never have to witness. Jack didn't ask where he came from, or how he ended up in the storm. The boy's silence spoke volumes, and Jack wasn't about to press him for answers just yet. "Don't worry, you're safe now," Jack murmured, though he wasn't entirely sure of that himself. There was something strange about this encounter, something that didn't sit right with him. Why was the boy out here alone in the middle of a storm? Where were his people? Jack didn't have the answers, but the boy's presence brought an unfamiliar sense of unease. Still, he couldn't bring himself to turn the boy away. In a world that often seemed cold and harsh, Jack had always believed in helping those in need. Even if this was a stranger, he wasn't going to let him suffer out in the storm. That was the right thing to do. As the boy finished drinking, Jack stood up and walked over to a small stove in the corner. He started a fire, the warm glow filling the barn with light. The wind outside howled louder, but in the barn, the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the boy's soft breaths. Jack turned his back for a moment, rummaging through a box of supplies. He grabbed a few strips of dried meat and some bread, then returned to the boy. "You need to eat," Jack said gently, offering the food. The boy took it without a word, his hands shaking as he tore off a piece of bread. Jack watched him closely, unsure of what to say next. The boy seemed to have no family and no protection. He was a stranger in a world that didn't always welcome strangers. Jack couldn't help but wonder what had happened to him, but the boy didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the fire as if it was the only thing that made sense in a world that no longer did. As Jack sat back down, his mind raced. The storm had made everything unclear, but one thing was certain. This boy was not from around here. There was something different about him, something Jack couldn't put his finger on. Maybe it was his eyes, those dark, knowing eyes that seemed too old for his face. Or maybe it was the way he moved, as if he was used to traveling long distances, carrying a weight that most people couldn't understand. Jack shook his head, trying to push the thoughts from his mind. He wasn't going to get answers tonight. For now, all he could do was offer what little help he could. But as he sat there, staring into the fire, a deep sense of unease settled in his chest. The boy had come to him for a reason. Jack didn't know what that reason was, but he knew it was far from ordinary. The storm raged through the night. Jack hadn't slept much, but the crackling of the fire and the occasional groan of the wind were oddly comforting. The boy Talon had eventually fallen into a restless sleep on the pile of hay, wrapped in the blanket Jack had given him. His breathing had steadied, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about this boy, something he didn't understand. By morning, the storm had passed. The wind had died down, leaving the air cool and fresh. Jack stepped outside the barn, wiping his tired eyes. The storm had left behind a blanket of mist that hung low over the land, making everything look strange and unfamiliar. It was a new day, but something about it felt different. Jack stretched his back, working out the stiffness from the long night. His thoughts were still on Talon. The boy had barely spoken, and Jack couldn't help but wonder who he was running from, or what kind of trouble he was in. The silence between them was heavy, but Jack knew that wasn't the boy's fault. He'd seen the way Talon's eyes flickered to the door every time someone approached, always on edge, as if he expected someone to follow him. Jack pushed those thoughts aside for now. He had to check on his cattle, make sure everything was in order. He had learned long ago that the land didn't wait for anyone, no matter how tired or distracted you were. As Jack worked, the morning sun began to break through the mist, casting a soft light over the land. It was a peaceful sight, but it didn't last long. His horses, usually calm and quiet, began to stir. Their hooves thudded against the ground as they moved restlessly in their stalls. Jack frowned, glancing up at the barn. He wasn't sure why, but the uneasy feeling in his chest seemed to grow. Something wasn't right. Jack made his way back to the barn, taking his time, as if trying to shake off the sense of dread that had settled in his stomach. When he opened the door, he was greeted by the sight of Talon sitting up, staring at the morning light streaming through the gaps in the barn walls. The boy looked different in the daylight, more fragile somehow. His dark eyes seemed lost, as if they were searching for something but not finding it. Talon didn't move when Jack entered, but his eyes flicked toward him briefly. Jack offered him a half-smile. "You feeling better?" Jack asked, his voice rough from the night's silence. The boy nodded, though he didn't say a word. Jack could see the exhaustion in his face, the way his shoulders slumped even as he sat up. There was a kind of sadness in him, something deeper than mere fatigue. Jack had seen it in people before, the look of someone who had been through something far too big for them to handle. It was in Talon's eyes, clear as day. "I've got some fresh water if you're thirsty," Jack said, walking toward the small table where he had left a jug of water. He poured it into a cup, but before he could offer it to Talon, a loud noise from outside interrupted him. It was the sound of hooves, fast and heavy. Jack froze. The sound of the horses grew louder, and the unmistakable thud of riders on horseback grew closer. His heart skipped a beat. The boy's reaction was immediate. He stood up quickly, his eyes wide, his body tense as though every muscle was on alert. He moved toward the corner of the barn, backing away from the door. Jack glanced at him, his stomach tightening. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he had a bad feeling. The last thing he needed was trouble on his land, especially trouble that could be tied to a strange boy he had just found in the storm. The sound of the hooves grew louder still, and Jack's instinct told him to stay calm, not to make any sudden moves. He glanced toward the boy. "You stay here," Jack ordered quietly. His voice was steady, but inside his nerves were on edge. Whatever was happening outside, he wasn't sure how it would play out. Jack stepped outside cautiously, peering over the side of the barn toward the sound of the horses. He could see the dust rising in the distance, but he couldn't make out who was coming. He instinctively reached for his rifle, just in case, though he wasn't eager to use it. As the riders came into view, Jack's heart sank. There were at least 24, their horses kicking up dust as they rode across the plain. They were all wearing leather armor, their faces hard and determined. They were native warriors, but there was something different about them, something that made them look like they were from another time, another world. The lead rider, a tall man with a painted face, rode forward. His horse moved with a confidence that Jack recognized, the kind of confidence that only came with experience. The warrior's eyes locked onto Jack's, and for a moment neither of them moved. The air between them was tense, thick with the unknown. "Who are you?" Jack asked, his voice low and cautious. He kept his rifle by his side, though he didn't aim it at anyone. The warrior spoke, his voice deep and commanding. "We are the warriors of the great tribe of the Red Sky. We seek the boy." Jack's stomach dropped. The boy. "Tannic." "I don't know what you mean," Jack said quickly, his mind racing. He hadn't been expecting this. Not today, not ever. "The boy you're looking for is inside. He's just a child." The leader's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for the riders to circle around the barn. "He is not just a child," the warrior said, his voice steady but filled with a strange intensity. He is the one who will change everything. Where is he? He couldn't tell them the truth. Not yet, at least. He had no idea what was going on or why these men were after Talon, but he knew one thing. They weren't here for a friendly visit. Jack swallowed hard. "I won't let you take him," he said firmly. The warrior didn't respond immediately. He studied Jack for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, without another word, he turned his horse and motioned for the others to follow. The group of riders spread out, creating a ring around the barn. Jack stood frozen for a moment, not sure what to do next. He turned and walked back into the barn, his mind spinning. Talon was no longer hiding in the corner. He was standing near the door, watching the scene unfold outside. His eyes met Jack's, and for the first time Jack saw fear in them. "What do they want with me?" Talon asked softly, his voice barely a whisper. Jack didn't know how to answer. But one thing was clear. These men weren't going to leave without taking the boy. Jack didn't know what kind of trouble he had just stumbled into, but he knew this. He wasn't going to let anyone take Talon without a fight. Jack stood in the barn, his heart pounding as he watched the group of warriors circle around his home. The air felt thick with tension, and he could see the fear in Talon's eyes. The boy had been quiet up until now, but his nervous energy was palpable. Jack's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. He had no idea why these warriors were after the boy, but one thing was clear. They were serious. Outside, the warriors were still riding in a circle, their horses snorting and stamping as they waited for the word from their leader. Jack could see the tall warrior who had spoken to him earlier, his dark eyes fixed on the barn. He was waiting for something, or someone. The other riders stood guard, keeping a close watch on the area as if expecting more trouble. Jack took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The boy needed answers, and Jack needed to protect him. But the warriors weren't here for a peaceful visit. Jack was certain of that. "You need to stay here," Jack said to Talon, his voice low but firm. "Don't come out. I'll figure this out." Talon nodded, but his eyes were filled with doubt. He seemed like he wanted to say something, but instead he just stood there, watching Jack with an expression that spoke volumes. Jack turned back toward the door, stepping outside slowly. He kept his hand near the rifle slung across his shoulder, just in case. He wasn't about to start a fight, but he wasn't about to back down either. Not with Talon's life on the line. The lead warrior, the one who had spoken earlier, noticed Jack's approach and gave a slight nod. He didn't look threatening, but there was a power in his presence that was impossible to ignore. Jack stopped a few feet away, standing tall but cautious. "You've come a long way," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What do you want with that boy?" The warrior's eyes narrowed, his face a mask of solemn resolve. "The boy is not just any child," he said, his voice deep and steady. "He is the heir of a great legacy. The tribe has been searching for him." Jack didn't know what to say. "A legacy?" he repeated, confused. "What kind of legacy?" The warrior sighed, as though it was difficult to explain something so important to someone who didn't understand. "The boy carries the bloodline of the Red Sky tribe. He is the key to a prophecy that has been foretold for generations. His power is something that cannot be ignored." Jack stood there, processing the words. A prophecy? Power? What was this man talking about? He glanced back at the barn, where Talon was still hidden inside, no doubt listening to every word. "What kind of power?" Jack asked, his voice rising with frustration. "What makes him so special?" He seemed to study Jack, looking for any sign of deception. When he spoke again, his voice softened just slightly. "The boy is the last of his kind. His people were scattered long ago, forced into hiding. But now the time has come for the prophecy to unfold." Jack's mind was spinning. This was far more than he had bargained for. He'd known there was something strange about the boy, but he never expected something like this. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jack said, shaking his head. "But I found him in the storm. He was starving. I couldn't just leave him out there." The warrior's gaze softened, and for the first time Jack saw a hint of something like respect in his eyes. "You have done what is right. But now the boy's destiny calls him. The tribe must protect him." Back. Jack swallowed hard. He knew the warriors weren't going to leave without Talon, but there was still one thing Jack couldn't understand. If the boy was so important, why had he been alone in the storm? Why had he been wandering, starving, and lost? Before Jack could voice another question, the warrior spoke again. "The boy was running from something," he said quietly. "He is not only the heir to the tribe, he is also the last hope of many. There are those who would kill him for his power, others who would use him for their own gain. He looked back at the barn again. Talon was hiding, but Jack knew the boy was listening. Whatever was happening, whatever Talon's true purpose was, it had to be dangerous, and the boy was caught in the middle of it. "Who are you running from, Talon?" Jack whispered under his breath, though he wasn't sure the boy could hear him. Just then, the sound of approaching horses cut through the air. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He turned toward the direction of the noise, and sure enough, a group of riders appeared on the horizon. They were not the warriors who had been circling his barn. These were strangers, their faces hidden behind helmets and their horses moving at a fast pace. They were coming straight for him, and Jack knew right away that they weren't here to talk. The lead warrior seemed to sense the threat as well. His hand went to the hilt of his blade, but his expression remained calm. He didn't say anything, but the way he held himself told Jack everything he needed to know. "Get back to the barn," the warrior said. "I will handle this." Jack hesitated, but knew better than to argue. He turned quickly and ran back to the barn, his heart racing in his chest. Inside, Talon was waiting, his face pale with worry. "They're coming," Jack said urgently. "Stay out of sight. Don't come out no matter what." Talon nodded, his eyes wide with fear, but he didn't argue. Jack rushed to the back of the barn, his eyes searching for any way to protect the boy. The riders were closing in, and Jack had no choice but to face them head on. Outside, the warriors and the mysterious riders met in the open field. Words were exchanged, harsh and low, but Jack couldn't hear them clearly from inside the barn. The wind carried the sound of hooves and then the clash of metal on metal. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared himself for what was to come. The battle that followed was nothing like he had ever seen. The warriors fought with skill and precision, but the strangers were relentless, their weapons glowing with an otherworldly light. Jack could hear the cries of battle, the sound of swords clashing, and the thud of bodies hitting the ground. Jack stood frozen in the barn, his hands trembling as he tried to make sense of the chaos outside. But one thing was clear. Talon was at the center of it all. And whatever the boy's true purpose was, it had just become a fight for survival. The sound of battle outside the barn was deafening. The warriors, their horses galloping in synchronized rhythm, clashed with the strangers in a storm of dust and steel. Jack stood in the barn, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the crack of weapons, the shouts of battle, and the thundering hooves of the horses as they charged back and forth across the dry land. Each sound echoed in his mind, amplifying the chaos around him. Jack could only imagine what was happening outside. The warriors and the strangers fought fiercely, but Jack knew the stakes had grown higher. Talon was the key. Whatever his bloodline was, whatever prophecy he carried, it had now drawn the attention of more than just these two groups. Jack couldn't stand by and let the boy be dragged into a conflict that wasn't his. He turned to Talon, who had been silently watching the scene from the corner of the barn. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them. Determination, as if he knew his time had come. As if he knew this was part of his destiny. Talon had hardly spoken since Jack found him, but Jack could sense the weight of his silence. The boy wasn't just a victim in this. He was a player, whether he wanted to be or not. Jack couldn't understand it all, but he knew the boy had no choice but to face whatever was coming. "You need to stay here," Jack said, his voice firm as he walked over to Talon. "I'll handle this." "Keep out of sight." Talon shook his head slowly, his expression resolute. "I can't hide forever," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the battle. "I can't run from who I am." Jack stopped in his tracks, surprised by the boy's words. Talon had spoken, not just out of fear, but with an understanding that Jack hadn't seen before. It was as if Talon had known all along that he would be forced to confront this moment. His destiny was bigger than either of them could have imagined. Jack placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, trying to offer some comfort. "You don't have to face this alone. But you need to stay safe for now. Let me handle it." But Talon's gaze never left him. "They're coming for me. I can't let them destroy everything." He knew Talon was right. As much as Jack wanted to protect him, there was a bigger fight unfolding, one that neither of them could escape. The warriors weren't just here for the boy. They were here for what Talon represented. A power that had been hidden for generations. A power that Jack didn't understand, but could feel in his bones. Before Jack could respond, there was a sudden deafening crash. The barn door shuddered under the impact. Jack spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. A moment later, the door flew open, and a rider, covered in dust, rode into the barn. It was one of the warriors, but his face was bruised and bloodied, his horse trembling beneath him. "They're too strong," the warrior gasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We can't hold them off much longer. We need to leave now." Jack's heart sank. He had never seen fear in the warrior's eyes before, but now it was clear. The strangers were not just another band of raiders. They were a force to be reckoned with, and they were closing in fast. "What about Talon?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic inside him. "We can't protect him here," the warrior said grimly. "We need to move or they'll take him." "You're the only one who can keep him safe now." Jack's mind raced. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He was just a rancher. But something in the warrior's eyes, something in the weight of the words, made him understand. This wasn't about him. This wasn't about his ranch or his life. It was about something much bigger. Talon was the key, and if the boy fell into the wrong hands, everything would change, and Jack couldn't let that happen. "Get on your horse," Jack ordered, his voice sharp. "We're leaving. We'll take him with us." The warrior didn't hesitate. He urged his horse forward, and Jack quickly grabbed Talon's arm, pulling him toward the door. "Where are we going?" Jack didn't have a clear answer, but he knew they had to leave the barn. It was no longer safe here. The battle outside was drawing closer, and the enemies would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. "We're going to the hills," Jack said, his voice low. "We'll get a better view. We can figure this out, but we need to move fast." The two of them ran to the horses, with the warrior following closely behind. As Jack swung himself onto his horse, he looked back at the barn. His home. A sanctuary. It was no longer a safe place. Talon climbed onto his own horse, still looking uncertain. Jack could see the conflict in his eyes. Talon wasn't used to running. He wasn't used to fear. But Jack knew that running wasn't a weakness. It was survival. Sometimes, survival meant knowing when to fight and when to flee. With a final glance at the barn, Jack urged his horse forward, leading the way toward the hills. The warriors and the strangers would soon realize they were gone, but by then, Jack hoped they'd be far enough ahead to make a stand. The journey was tense. The sound of hooves echoed in the quiet morning as the three riders made their way across the open plain, heading toward the hills. Jack's thoughts were consumed by the battle. They couldn't outrun their enemies forever. Eventually, they'd have to face them, and when that time came, Jack knew they would need more than just speed. They'd need to fight. Talon rode silently beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon, but Jack could see the strain in his face. He didn't belong in this world of violence. He was just a boy, caught in the middle of a war that he didn't fully understand. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jack asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Talon didn't answer right away. He seemed to weigh the words carefully before he spoke. "I didn't want anyone to know," he said quietly. "I didn't want to bring this danger to you." Jack nodded, understanding more than the boy knew. Talon hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't asked to be part of a prophecy or to be hunted by mercenaries. But now that he was here, Jack knew that he couldn't turn his back on him. "We'll figure this out," Jack said firmly. "No one is taking you. Not on my watch." They reached the hills just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. From their vantage point, they could see the warriors and the strangers still locked in battle below. But now, Jack could see something else. A group of riders, coming up from the opposite side. The battle was far from over. And now, Jack realized, it wasn't just about protecting Talon. It was about survival. And it was about fighting for something worth protecting.